By the mid-90s, Sega and Nintendo had both established their new consoles and handhelds in the ever-growing gaming scene. The rivalry between the two companies was a public spectacle, with everyone from top executives to young gamers picking sides in the conflict. Going into 1993, everything seemed to be about the same. Nintendo and Sega were continuing to release new titles for their home consoles, with murmurs of a new generation on the horizon. However, a new foe, one larger than both Sega and Nintendo, was setting itself up to challenge the gaming industry. And unlike the other combatants, this threat didn't have a game console or even games. The new threat was the United States government. This is the story of the Great Console War between Sega and Nintendo. In this part, we'll be taking a look at many of the most notable games to come out during the mid-1990s. We'll also be taking a dive into the legal battle between the ever-growing video game industry and the might behind the United States government as they reacted to the public's growing concerns over violence in gaming. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and the Sega Genesis were the talk of the town at the end of 1992, but that didn't mean there weren't quality games coming to the Super Nintendo in the year after its launch. Mario had his time to shine with the launch of the Super Nintendo, but following games wouldn't see the plumber in a platforming game. The hottest holiday title for the Super Nintendo was a racing game set in the Mushroom Kingdom itself, called Super Mario Kart. The first entry in what would become one of Nintendo's best-selling sub-series, Super Mario Kart was a massive success on the Super Nintendo, selling over 8 million units before the system was discontinued. Another Mario spin-off, Mario Paint, came out in August of 1992. Bundled with the Super Nintendo mouse accessory, Mario Paint offered up a simple-to-use but insanely deep artist studio for gamers. It didn't offer much in the way of intense gaming, but the software helped spark an interest in art and music for an entire generation of creators. Another accessory for the Super Nintendo hit store shelves in early 1992 in North America. The Super Scope was a follow-up to the popular NES Zapper, giving the Super Nintendo its own variation of the light gun. The Super Scope came bundled with the game Super Scope 6, which offered 6 different games on the cartridge to play with the accessory. The Super Scope came to PAL territories later in 1992, and Japan saw a limited release of the accessory in 1993. Unfortunately, the Super Scope was never as successful as the NES Zapper, and only a total of 12 games were released for the Super Nintendo that were compatible with the accessory. Additional Super Nintendo games rolled out onto the system throughout the year, with many classic NES games receiving sequels on Nintendo's 16-bit machine. Konami's Contra series received a third installment, with Contra 3: The Alien Wars in early 1992. Square developed an original Final Fantasy for the Super Nintendo called Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Released first in North America in 1992, the spin-off RPG was an attempt to make the genre more accessible to American gamers. Releases in other regions followed in late 1992 and 1993. Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series saw its third entry as well, when The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past debuted in North America in April of 1992, after being released in Japan the year earlier. Unlike Zelda 2 on the NES, A Link to the Past returned to the top-down style of play that Zelda 1 featured. Future titles in the series would continue using this format until the advent of 3D games. The Super Nintendo was building a library to match any other game console, but the system was starting to become outdated by the end of 1992. The new CD-based accessories for the Sega Genesis showed what the future of gaming was slowly becoming. To make matters worse, a new batch of consoles, even more powerful than the Super Nintendo, were just around the corner, with the first 5th generation consoles launching at the end of 1993. For Nintendo, innovation was necessary to keep their new Super Nintendo afloat. The solution to this problem was a small chip, included in every copy of Nintendo's most technically advanced game to date, Star Fox. Development of Star Fox was handled by Nintendo EAD and Argonaut Games, with Shigeru Miyamoto designing the characters and producing the game. Gameplay and level design was primarily handled by Nintendo, with inspirations for the series coming from Star Wars, the puppet drama Thunderbirds, and even the Sinbo Torii Gates at a nearby shrine that was just a few minutes away from Nintendo's headquarters. On the hardware side, Argonaut Games wanted to push the Super Nintendo to its limits. Argonaut previously worked with Nintendo on the Game Boy game X that released in 1992. Like Star Fox, X was a 3D space shooter designed by Dylan Cuthbert. Unfortunately for Cuthbert and the other designers at Argonaut, the Super Nintendo didn't have any way of processing 3D images to the extent necessary for the team. custom hardware was needed to truly make their ambitions come to life. A team of designers came together to create a new chip that could be put into the cartridges of these Super Nintendo titles. Originally under the codename Super Mario FX, the Super FX chip made its debut with Star Fox in the first half of 1993. The added chip made Star Fox a sight to behold on the Super Nintendo. This wasn't a Mode 7 illusion. Star Fox featured fully polygonal graphics for its gameplay, with sprites used for its HUD and menus. The Super FX chip came with a downside. The high costs associated with manufacturing the chip led to higher retail costs, and few other Super Nintendo games would use the chip. Still, Star Fox was a major hit, selling over 4 million units and spawning a series of sequels on future Nintendo systems. Sega was riding on the momentum of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 going into 1993. However, a new platforming Sonic game for the Genesis wouldn't come out until early 1994. Instead, Sega focused on other IPs leading up to the holiday season. In July, Shining Force came out on the Genesis, following up the 1989 original game Shining in the Darkness. Konami released Rocket Knight Adventures in August, giving the Genesis one of its best games to date. In September, Treasure's Gunstar Heroes was released. Published by Sega, Gunstar Heroes showed off the power of the base set Genesis, rivaling that of Nintendo's Star Fox. December saw the release of ToeJam and Earl, Panic and Funkatron, a sequel to the Genesis original. In Japan, the fourth title in Sega's RPG series, Phantasy Star, was released in December, although a version for North America wouldn't release until 1995. Sega's big holiday title for 1993 was Sonic Spinball, a pinball game starring Sega's mascot. All of these releases were accompanied by a new model of the Sega Genesis, known as the Genesis 2. Compared to the original model released in 1989, the new model of the Genesis was slightly smaller and sleeker, but came at a cost. Many audio options from the original model were not included in the second model. The Sega CD saw new releases too. While the user base for the Sega CD was much smaller than the Genesis, notable games were still coming to the system in the latter half of 1993. Lunar, the Silver Star, hit the Sega CD in December of 1993. The biggest game for the Sega CD came in November of 1993. Developed primarily by the remaining Sonic 1 developers in Japan, Sonic CD was the killer app the Sega CD needed to bring on more gamers. Sonic CD featured FMV cutscenes, high-quality audio, and the fast-paced Sonic gameplay players loved. A new model of the Sega CD was also introduced. The new model axed the motorized disk drive of the original and featured a smaller design like the Genesis Model 2. The handheld front was quiet for most of 1993. Outside of ports and licensed games, the Game Boy and Game Gear only received a handful of notable releases. On the Game Gear, Sonic Chaos released in November of 1993. It was the first original Sonic game developed for the Game Gear, as past entries were developed based on the Genesis originals. For the Game Boy, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening continued the trend of bringing Nintendo's biggest IPs to the handheld. Link's Awakening was a huge hit on the system, showing gamers that a title almost as complex as A Link to the Past on Super Nintendo was available on the 4-year-old system. Link's Awakening has since been remade twice, once for the Game Boy Color with Link's Awakening DX, and recently with a full 3D remake for the Nintendo Switch. A few other big games hit the Super Nintendo in the second half of 1993. That summer, Super Mario All-Stars was released. All-Stars included full 16-bit remakes of Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario Bros. 3. A fourth game, titled Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, made its Western debut in the collection. Originally released as Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan, the game was replaced with a redesigned version of Doki Doki Panic for Western audiences. For third parties, Square continued their streak of quality releases on the Super Nintendo, with Secret of Mana, an action RPG that released in the latter half of 1993. 1993 was the first year that multi-platform releases between the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were becoming more popular, thanks to Nintendo loosening their restrictions on games being published for their system. Zombies Ate My Neighbors from Konami was a hit on both the Genesis and Super Nintendo, although the Super Nintendo version came out 2 months before the Genesis. One of 93's biggest multi-platform releases came via Disney and their smash hit movie, Aladdin. Unlike other multi-platform games, however, the licensing for 1993's Aladdin was split up between different consoles. On the Super Nintendo, an arcade platformer developed by Capcom came out in November, just before the holiday rush. Aladdin was a big hit on the Super Nintendo, but all eyes were glued to the Genesis version. Developed by Virgin Interactive, Aladdin on the Genesis was a sight to behold. The gameplay wasn't quite as tight and platform heavy as the Super Nintendo version, but it featured some of the best animation seen in a video game to date. Virgin's version had the luxury of being designed in partnership with the animators at Disney, giving the Genesis a game that looked like no other. In the end, the Genesis version was the victor, selling over 4 million copies compared to the 1.8 million copies sold on Super Nintendo. But Aladdin wouldn't be the biggest game on the Genesis that year. Instead, the news cycle was dominated by a port of a fighting game that was released in arcades just a year earlier. Street Fighter II's release in 1991 set off a flurry of copycats and clones in an attempt to capitalize on the fighting game's success. The game caught the attention of several developers, including the team at Midway Games. A small team of developers at Midway, led by Ed Boon and John Tobias, set out to craft a game that was visually superior to Street Fighter II and one that gobbled up just as many quarters in the arcade. Development of the game was handled by only 4 people and completed in around a 10-month period. The title was Mortal Kombat. As soon as the game hit the arcades in October of 1992, it was a massive success. The game featured a unique 5-button control scheme and digitized graphics of real people. But the real draw of Mortal Kombat came from the excessive blood and gore in the game. Punching or kicking enemies caused buckets of blood to fly in every direction. Mortal Kombat also had finishing moves known as fatalities. After beating an enemy in combat, the words "finish them" would appear on screen. If the winning player entered the right button presses, a fatality would play out, with characters being killed in a manner of different ways. The popularity of Mortal Kombat quickly grew, and ports to home consoles were inevitable. Acclaim Entertainment acquired publishing rights for home consoles and began a massive marketing campaign for its upcoming release. Taking a note from Sega's playbook, Acclaim opted to release Mortal Kombat in North America with a street date. Dubbed Mortal Monday, Mortal Kombat hit the Genesis, Super Nintendo, Sega Game Gear, and Game Boy on September 13, 1993. Mortal Kombat's popularity came with controversy, however. The large amounts of blood and gore caught the eye of advocacy groups, and a public discussion surrounding violence in video games began. Fearing backlash and wanting to keep their family-friendly image safe, Nintendo opted not to include blood in the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat. The red blood was replaced with gray pools of sweat. Sega followed suit with the Genesis version, but included a secret code to unlock the blood and gore from the original arcade release. The difference was stunning. While Mortal Kombat sold a total of over 3 million copies across all systems, the Genesis version was by far the most popular, with some estimates saying it outsold Nintendo's counterpart 3-1. The controversy surrounding Mortal Kombat didn't stop with concerned parents. With calls from constituents across the country, the United States Congress intervened in December of 1993, holding the first congressional hearings on violence in video games. Led by Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, no one in the video games industry was spared from Congress's oversight. This included Nintendo and Sega, both of whom sent representatives to Washington to avoid congressional intervention into the blossoming games industry. Nintendo chose Vice President of Nintendo of America, Howard Lincoln, to testify for them. Lincoln, a lawyer by profession, came in guns blazing against Sega during the hearing. Lincoln claimed that Nintendo kept violent games off their system, noting Mortal Kombat's lack of blood on the Super Nintendo. Lincoln even made the statement that Night Trap, another game under the microscope of the hearing, would never appear on a Nintendo console. Sega was represented by Bill White, Vice President of Sega of America. White struggled more than Lincoln during the congressional hearings, but tried his best to paint Sega in a good light. Rather than try to downplay the mature themes in their games, White argued that games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat were meant for adults rather than children. White also took swipes at Nintendo for not having their own rating system, something Sega had implemented a few years earlier. The senators in attendance felt like their concerns were not addressed following the testimonies. Wisconsin Senator Herb Kohl gave Nintendo and Sega an ultimatum: either come up with your own rating system, or the United States government would do it for them. After years of competing with one another, Sega and Nintendo had no choice but to work together to create an entire rating system for the whole games industry. Thanks for watching. This is the 5th part of a multi-part series covering the great console war between Sega and Nintendo. If you enjoyed the video, Remember to leave a like and share this video on your favorite social media sites to help this channel grow. Subscribe to catch the next episode when it comes out next week. In the next part, Sega and Nintendo's war continues with the release of some of the most graphically advanced games of the era, and a new challenger, one that would take the gaming world by storm, finally enters the ring as the 5th generation of gaming truly begins.